the image of the lazy woman of color, sort of pumping out children to get federal assistance, right, to get welfare assistance. That narrative was so effectively used when in fact that narrative is completely and utterly false. Hi, my name is Michelle Holder. I'm currently Assistant Professor of Economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. I did a paper for an organization called the Roosevelt Institute, and the paper's title is The Double Gap in the Bottom Line, African American Women's Earnings and Corporate Profits. And so I use the term double gap in this research to reflect the fact that although Black women in the United States have a very long and deep history as workers in the United States, starting obviously from the time before emancipation and certainly after, their work has not been properly or adequately compensated. So what African American women face in the American labor market is essentially their labor is undervalued. And the double gap means that Black women in the United States are in a labor market where they face wage penalties based on both their gender and their race. We're all pretty familiar with the term the gender wage gap, which certainly Black women have to deal with. But what sets Black women apart from sort of all women, and primarily white women, is that they also face a racial wage gap. And so I call the wage penalties that Black women face in the American workforce, I call it the double gap. Because alone, both the gender wage gap singularly and the racial wage gap singularly, that's not what we see Black women facing. We see them facing a wage gap larger than just the gender wage gap and one larger than just the racial wage gap. So the combined effect I call the double gap. Now, it's not necessarily an additive relationship. It's not as if you could just add the gender wage gap and the racial wage gap and voila, you have the double gap. It's a little more complicated than that. But indeed, the wage penalties that Black women face are larger than either just the racial wage gap or just the gender wage gap. On average, Black women earn less than white women compared to men. So typically, neoclassical theory explains wage gaps as having to do with human capital skills, right? So ostensibly, what you are being paid as a wage, you are being compensated for the human capital attributes that you bring to the position. Now, neoclassical economic theory, however, falls short in explaining the double gap that Black women face, because if you look at equally qualified, equally educated white men and Black women in the American labor market, there is in almost every instance in major occupational categories a difference in compensation. And so it's trying to use mainstream economic theory and what it says about human capital acquisition to explain why Black women are underpaid is simply insufficient. Because, as I said, if you compare equally qualified, equally experienced, equally educated white men and Black women in the same job, more often than not, or most often than not, it is the case that white men earn more than Black women. That you cannot explain that by simply attributing it to fewer human capital endowments among Black women. There is a really big characteristic and quality of Black women in the American labor force that I think gets very little attention. In fact, it often gets overlooked. And that is African American women have been an incredibly loyal demographic in the American workforce, meaning that their labor force participation rate, as measured by what percent of working age Black women are attached to the American workforce, has consistently and historically been higher than that of white women. And so it's ironic to me that there are all of these preconceptions about Black women regarding their, how hardworking they are. Certainly I would reference the whole welfare reform debate of the 90s, where the image of the lazy woman of color, sort of pumping out children to get federal assistance, right, to get welfare assistance, that narrative was so effectively used, when in fact that narrative is completely and utterly false. Black women are a hard-working and long-standing, in a long-standing sense, a hard-working demographic in the United States. Married Black women, single Black women. And so if there's one thing that I like to make sure I highlight in my research on Black women, it is that work history, because it is I believe there's this story that has taken hold in the American conscience about Black women's labor that is completely antithetical to the real story and the real history of working Black women. Almost without exception, equally qualified, equally skilled, equally educated Black women in American society can fully expect at some point in their careers to be undervalued and underpaid. I looked at, obviously, the major occupational groups. I also looked at, over 70 minor occupational groups, and almost without exception, in every instance, in every occupation, major and minor, that I looked at, white men out-earned Black women. And we're talking about white men and Black women with pretty much the same human capital endowments and human capital attributes, same educational level. In fact, in the report that I did, I actually relegated my analysis just to college-educated Black women, or Black women with high educational attainment levels. But again, almost with few exceptions, Black women earned less than white men in every major occupational category and practically every minor occupational category. One of the things I think has been missing when we talk about the gender wage gap, and we talk about how it affects Black women, one of the things that I think has been missing in this discourse is, how does it affect the community? Because from my estimation, it feels like when we talk about the gender wage gap and its impact, we tend to talk about it in terms of the individual, right? And that, well, it's affecting this person, and perhaps, maybe she just lacks negotiation skills. Maybe her networks are weak. Maybe, her research wasn't properly conducted to kind of determine what would be adequate and fair compensation for the position that she's going to assume in the organization or the company. But I wanted to pull back from sort of this individual examination of the impact of the gender wage gap and the racial wage gap. And I wanted to look at it in terms of what is lost to the Black community in the United States as a result of Black women being almost universally undervalued no matter where she works in the United States. And so I essentially, I used in my report, I I had three different methodologies to try to aggregate what I call this sort of involuntary forfeiture. And I call it, I don't, I don't, I don't classify it necessarily because I've been asked the question, why don't you just straight out say these women are they're being robbed, right? They're being, well, I can't say that as an economist because these wages are something these women voluntarily accept. The issue is that, they don't have all the information that employers have, right? So but that's true for all workers. So I classify it and I qualify it as involuntary forfeiture because these women don't know they're being undervalued, right? They've negotiated their compensation to some degree, but nevertheless they are being undervalued, and the loss in earnings that that is resulting from the combined effect of the gender and racial wage gaps is money that is, you can't necessarily call it lost to them, but it is something that they should be entitled to that they don't receive. So I was struggling to sort of figure out how to express this loss in earnings, and I can't just say, oh, capitalists are robbing black women, right? In my study, I try to aggregate. I try to figure out what is the impact on the black community, black Americans writ large in the United States, given that black women are fairly regularly undervalued and undercompensated. And so using three different methodologies, one of which was an independent methodology by a guy named Tom Masterson, who works for the Levy Institute at Bard College. He and I sometimes collaborate on projects. And so we essentially use the American Community Survey as our data set, which is a very robust, rich data set. And I guess I don't want to bore you going through all of the machinations, but I essentially quantified the involuntary forfeiture of wages borne by black women given gender and racial wage gaps at $50 billion a year. And my period of examination was 2017. So, obviously if we're, trying to quantify what it looks like years going forward, right, it would be, we'd have to take into account inflation, et cetera. But $50 billion per year is what is lost to the African American community. And this is a reoccurring loss. This is a loss every year given the double gap. There are a couple of occupations that are real standouts in terms of the degree to which black women's work is really undervalued and undercompensated. Those would include the legal occupation, management occupations, engineering and architecture, really STEM-related fields. Those were the real standouts in terms of, a really sizable gap between what black women earned and what white men earned in the same job, given the same characteristics. The $50 billion in that black women don't receive, right, as a result of gender and racial wage gaps, the double gap. One assumes it's going somewhere, right? And so I don't necessarily hypothesize who is benefiting. I guess is it cui bono, the Italian phrase, who benefits? There could be different parties that benefit. There could be the shareholders of private for-profit corporations. My examination was only restricted to the private for-profit sector. So I didn't look at black women working in the public sector at all. And I didn't look at black women working in the nonprofit sector. I only looked at the private for-profit sector. So who benefits? It could be shareholders. It could be other workers in the organization, in the company. It could be consumers, right? They might, benefit from lower costs. I don't know who benefits, but what I can say I know is that it is not benefiting the Black community.